Here we are then, the start of the third module, Topic A, Local Sporting Bodies. And as you know by now, the first module was the Introduction to Globalization. The second module was the Global Sport System, initially the British influence on the spread and diffusion of sport, the Americanization in the 20th century, and ultimately the rise of post-Western sport. In Module 3, we're going to shift our focus, and our attention will turn toward global sport bodies. And what I should say is this, that we're going to go from a very macro, structural, big picture perspective down toward a much more localized level of the individual or individual bodily practices. So what we are trying to see is how that structure, those global networks and flows from the first and second modules are experienced and the meanings produced of the sporting bodies that produce those sports spectacles at a local level. So it's going from the macro to the micro in this module. And here we have the lecture outline. Within these 5 sections, we are looking at some quite interesting and different things. Section 1, Collective Embodiments, Sport and Creative Localization. Here, and we're really getting a bit anthropological to begin, we're looking at the sporting practices and experiences of everyday life. To do that, we're going to get to the work of Clifford Geertz, who is a famous anthropologist who looked at Balinese cockfighting. What he said was this, that you could find out the structure and logics of a society by looking at its public displayed material culture, i.e., its play in sport. What was displayed in Balinese cockfighting illustrated the shared structures, values, and meanings of the Balinese society at the time. But it's not just developing societies that we are looking at when we see the relationship between structure or logic of culture within the display of sport and play. I think that is true of developing societies as well. However, we will look at sports within indigenous societies just to start with, then those developing societies, and ultimately developed societies. Specifically, we're going to look at Brazil and the indigenous games of the tribes within Brazilian society. Because as you see, these pictures are very different than our understanding of what the modern sports system is. But they speak to the elements of nature of these indigenous tribal societies within Brazil. And if you look at what's going on here, it's not about finding the greatest athlete, it's not about really competition, it's about other things in terms of the relationship between individuals and the collective within that society. So we cannot apply a Western sport lens when we look at these types of activities. What we really have to do is find out more about the society in which these people are located and how these practices relate to the reproduction of the structure, the logics, the fabric of that society. And it is most definitely a Western sport culture that is different from what we're seeing here. The assumptions, the logics, the reasons why one would get involved in sport are different. For example, one tribe member here says, "We are not looking to crown champions or to find great athletes. Competition is more of a thing of the Western world anyway." So there you see a radical difference. It's not about winning, it's not about proving superiority. There's a different motivation, a different reason for why these individuals in this indigenous Brazilian community would engage in sport. And of course, that links back to the logics, the culture, and the values of that society. And interestingly, what we see here, this class really is about the global and the local. Not only do we have indigenous games being played, we have the emergence of Western modernized sport being played by the indigenous groupings. And even within indigenous games that are held every 4 years, similar to the Olympic Games. And so we see this westernization and this influence of the traditional indigenous games in Brazil. So we have soccer there that is played alongside the indigenous versions of football among these tribes where they are not allowed to use their hands. We have that indigenous version then, and the modernized version is being played side by side. So if Geertz was to look at this tribal relationship, he would say what's going on here is that we have societies in transition between indigenous and modern elements vying side by side for ideological supremacy. Another example of that is this. The fact that a tribe in the north of Brazil has its own professional football team made up of a mixture of indigenous and non-indigenous players. they have been moderately successful, and it again shows what we're looking at the sport and the play cultures of these societies, and the tensions between traditional and modern forms are clearly there as the societies are in transition and transforming themselves. Another example of this, and here we look at a society that has been in transition, and that is one of the Trobriand Island, just north of Australia. Now here, there is a form of cricket that has been played, and the Trobriand cricket is a classic example of a society in transition, and a way we can see that transition through the lens of its sport and play cultures. And also, as it says here, Trobriand cricket is a creative indigenous response to sporting colonialism. It was a rejection of that sporting colonialism at the time. And we can see here the Trobriand Islands in relation to Australia and the rest of the world. And we can really see this is a form of material culture, Trobriand cricket. The shared values of the society, the social relations and hierarchies are clearly evident within how this game is played, and ironically, how this game differs from the Western version of the game. But this is somewhat ironic because initially cricket was brought to the Trobriands as part of the British colonizing process. Missionaries, and more specifically M.K. Gilmore, brought the game in 1903, and the idea was that they wanted to impose this foreign game on the local tribes to stop them from engaging in moral warfare as a type of pacification and civilizing process. What you've got today are traditional forms of cricket still played within Papua New Guinea and the island structure. However, the Trobriands took the game that was imposed upon them and appropriated it and adapted it to their own culture and society. So cricket became an embodiment of Trobriand society and culture. I think if you really need to take a look at the video, and then on slide 20, I think this is quite remarkable as it's really a famous illustration of this process. The Trobriand Island video is played in almost every intro to sport sociology or sport globalization courses because it's about that appropriation and adaptation, and it's done on multiple different levels. There is the different social, political, cultural values of the Trobriands, and they're now reflected in the way the game of cricket is played locally. In the video, they talk about kayasa, the idea within the video, which is a form of competition, and that it's hosted and sponsored by local politicians as a way to secure power in a way. So they host a game and the feasts that go with it, and as you can see, there's nothing to do with the traditional British game. It's all about Trobriand society and how the game is adapted to their political, economic, and cultural structures as well. Over a short period of time, cricket within the Trobriands became a true form of local Trobriand identity. So what happened here was the invention of tribal or national tradition around cricket as it became rapidly indigenized and became an embodiment expression of what it meant to be a Trobriand Islander. It is quite similar to the way that T20 has become an expression of Indianness, perhaps the way that baseball became an expression of Americanness in the 19th and 20th century. And as a style of the game in both India and here in Trobriand, the examples speak to that local identity. So this is nothing new. We've seen these examples already within this course, but what's different is we're going to look at it more from a local embodiment perspective. And so it's this inventing of a national sport tradition, and it's something we referred to a number of times in this course, whether it be the United States or America around baseball, cricket in India, the Trobriand cricket example, or here, different sports around the world. Cycling in France, rugby union in New Zealand, soccer within England, and Gaelic football within Ireland. They each have a particular form of the game that is an expression and reproduction of dominant cultural values and customs and practices within that culture. So we could turn to New Zealand as yet another example. Here, rugby is the embodiment of that masculine settler society, as rugby is a crucial part of the way that New Zealanders invented their own sense of self, their own identity, their own nationhood as an extension or as they broke away and sought independence from Britain. Again, it was this independence movement within New Zealand at the same time that rugby union was emerging as a dominant cultural practice. So rugby union became entrenched as an articulation of New Zealand settler identity. It is steeped in masculine values, which were practiced by those masculine men who were on the farms. They were cultivating the land, and rugby became an extension of that identity and a key part of defining who New Zealanders were and what it meant to be a New Zealander. And here we have, again, another articulation of that the 1905 All Blacks, they're a famous team that goes back to Britain, and they beat the colonizer at their own game. In fact, they dominated England to the point that New Zealand became, very early on, a new legitimate nation because of their rugby playing, where in Britain they had saw them as a colony or a former colony. When the 1905 fabled All Blacks go back to Britain and beat up on the English national rugby team, it legitimized New Zealand as an independent and sovereign nation. And you'll see in great detail here that there's a symbiotic or two-way mutually dependent relationship between New Zealand and rugby union. One reflects and reinforces the other in numerous ways. It is part and parcel of being a New Zealander is to be enraptured in this new rugby union identity. And so from a Geertzian perspective, I think we can see how the structure and fabric of New Zealand culture is illustrated to us, and those shared meanings and social relations become embodied with and through rugby. So it's not just in the Trobrians or the indigenous tribes of Brazil. In developed Western nations like New Zealand, we see that our sports become practiced and embodied in a particular way. That may be obvious. It may be something that we really take for granted when we see the haka performed by the New Zealand All Blacks or Sonny Bill Williams, this fellow up here. They are very much embodying what it means to be a New Zealander. Here's just another example of the haka being performed. And look at the way that the haka is performed, and it's a sort of deeply spiritual dance linked to the indigenous population of New Zealand, the New Zealand Maori, and it's performed in international sport. It is an embodied practice that links to many of the ideas and values and traditions of New Zealand society. And this performance pre-match by the All Blacks, which some of you may have come across before, is a sort of reminder of those deeply entrenched cultural values. And so I think this is equally true within the contemporary US. We can look at the various sporting practices, both contemporary and historically, and we can see how the values, social relations, and the meanings of our society in the US are embedded within them. The values or social meanings, they may be different, but the Geertzian process of looking at these practices to discern the elements of wider society are similar to what we're looking at in other contexts. And as Hobsbawm famously says here, quote, "The individual, even the one who only cheers, becomes a symbol of his nation himself." And of course, I think what Hobsbawm is saying here is that as we become fans or spectators, they embody the particular characteristics of those players and the nations that they represent. And here, if we just look at a few quick examples with the United States, here we have example one of performing an American exceptionalism. In the United States, most of our allegiances fall within professional sport franchises rather than nationalistic ones. And while we do, as Americans, have a few national teams that we support, occasionally the women's or men's soccer teams, the men's basketball team during the Olympic Games, and some individual Olympians, we really don't have that national team that we get behind quite like maybe England does with their national football team, or Brazil, or maybe the New Zealanders and they get behind their rugby team, so forth and so on. Much of our imagined communities of fans and our fandom is linked to professional sport, which again links back to the political and dominant ideologies of what it means to be American. And it's much more of a commodified, corporatized version of sport as opposed to one that's steeped in national identity. In other words, we perform our national identity through professional private sport franchises whose purpose exists solely for the pursuit of profit, rather than perhaps a national team whose existence and purpose is to represent the nation. Secondly, so when we do this, when we perform our fandom, we're becoming symbols as individuals of the nation or those collective affiliations ourselves. And here are just a few examples in terms of spectating. So the way we both play the sport, in this example, or the sports that we play, also the spectating, the ways that we consume sport articulate back to the dominant values and cultures of the nation. And here's just a few examples of that. The national teams in a U.S. context, the ones that we do support, those players become representative embodiments of the nation. They typify the values and cultures of quote unquote what it means to be an American. And fans perform an elevated spectatorship or perform that identity. So I want you to reflect. How do you perform your fandom? The fandom that you do perform and support, does it tend to be of a private franchise whose purpose exists to exert profit or to extract profit in a professionalized setting? Or is the fandom that you prefer much more nationalistic? Or how does that value? Because I would argue that those two things are linked, and the nationalistic values of what it means to be American is so steeply entrenched in corporatization and commercialization that what it means to be an American is to consume the Super Bowl, a sport that is played almost exclusively in the United States, in a particular way that links back to American society rather than a sport on an international stage. So think about your own fandom and how you become a representative embodiment through consuming games on media or going to the games themselves as an extension of your national identity. However, it's not quite as straightforward as that within globalizing societies. It's not easy enough to say that we have these localized sport cultures that are embodied through the practices and the embodied forms of the athletes who play them. Because it's not quite as simple as that. It's a bit more complex. And the reason for that is this notion that there are orthodox bodies that are created by the international standardization of sport. And here's just a brief example of that. Here is the introduction or the founding of the largest governing bodies within sport. So we've got the IOC, FIFA, FINA, the IAAF, and FIBA, all around the turn of the 20th century, and FIBA a little bit later. And what this means is that there's the internationalization of sport, and the creation of international sport organizations led to a standardization of these things, a standardization of rules. Otherwise, you couldn't compete internationally, a standardization of equipment in order to have similar competitions, and even a standardization in terms of the strategies and techniques of how those sports are played. And this has had quite a significant effect on the standardization and standardizing of the sporting bodies around the world that play these sports. And this is what I mean by that. If you think back to this, there is a standardization process going on in terms of rules. We have almost a prehistoric activity, which is throwing a spear, and it was done in Roman, Greek, and prehistoric times. And it's still done in developing indigenous societies today. So how do you turn that into an international sport competition? Well, you need globally standardized rules to create this. So here's an excerpt from the rulebook of the IAAF related to the javelin. But that spear throwing becomes the javelin according to these rules. And these rules need standardization in terms of equipment and technology, and this is a mere snippet of the amount of detail that goes into standardizing the equipment, which is then used within those rules of the javelin competition. And what we also have is the global standardization of strategies. These strategies, formations, or tactics adopted within the game themselves. And here we have different football formations and that have become relatively standard across the world. And as you can see, the 4-4-2, the 4-2-3-1, the 4-5-1, and the 4-3-3, these are the preferred formations of the way in which players are arranged on a football pitch for sporting competitions. They are viewed as being the dominant or preferable ones, and really you'd be hard-pressed to find any formations that exist outside of these dominant, globally standardized strategies. And there's even this such thing as a false nine, which is a deep-lying center forward within football terms, and it's become a strategy that then becomes standardized or globalized around the world. So whereas at a time it was a sort of novel idea, now it becomes kind of a much more commonplace idea. Whether you're in Barcelona, a team in Japan, or Moscow, you might be playing a traditional formation such as the 4-4-2 or the but you would have this false nine position within that formation because it becomes quite standardized in terms of globalized terms. So there doesn't tend to be a nationalized or localized variation of how the game is played that stems from this massive standardization across international sport. Essentially, technique-wise, sports science has been excellent in creating ideal and the most efficient ways of doing things within sport, such that there's not much difference within the ways the games are played across global networks. That the global networks of coaching, along with the global flow of information and sporting bodies themselves, it diffuses a hegemonic or a dominant technique within a sport that becomes ubiquitous across the world. So there are preferred ways of doing things at any given time, and of course, there are innovations. However, these innovations tend to be communicated rapidly, and what is a novel technique or a novel formation or a novel idea becomes adopted more widely and quite quickly given the speed and reach of communication today. So there is little variation, one might argue, in terms of what the dominant ways of doing sport are at the elite level, because these coaches, these athletes, and the images and strategies of sport become diffused in quite quick ways. And we can think about this in a number of different ways in sports. Swimming is a classic example of how innovation changed the norms of technique quite rapidly. Here we can see the flip turn developed in 1936, and it was taken up rapidly by elite swimmers around the world. Going back a bit further, we had the evolution of strokes, from the truncheon to the Australian crawl to the American crawl, and apparently the difference between the Australian and American crawls is the small flutter kick at the back of the American compared to the more vigorous kick of the Australian. So this type of innovation and understanding became communicated across global coaching networks, such that there was a standardization of techniques around the world. Even minor skills like the Cruyff turn within soccer was done by Johan Cruyff in 1974, and it was watched by millions and then replicated badly, I would say, by a bunch of school children the next day. This skill at the time was a huge innovation, and as coaches saw it, it was taken up as a standardized skill such that any decent player would try it, and a generation on, every player, it would be argued, has the Cruyff turn in their arsenal. But my favorite example of this is the high jump. The high jump technique and the changes that resulted from this standardization is quite remarkable. Up until 1967, the Western roll and the scissors kick were the dominant way of doing it, and there was a split between the two within the Western roll and the scissors kick, where the Western roll became the preferable or dominant way and more popular way of doing it toward the end of the 1960s. However, Dick Fosbury came along and revolutionized the sport by developing his own technique for jumping, which is radically different, as you can see. The Fosbury flop emerges. Now, this is a fascinating discussion of how this innovation in technique went from being laughed at to being the normative or normalized way of jumping. If we look at any high jump competition at the elite level, you will see only this technique today. Virtually overnight, it became the dominant technique because of the fact that Fosbury won the 1968 Olympics, and the global network of coaches and televised spectators adapted it. And so what you see then of these examples is the increased role of sporting science in standardizing athletic performance to try and create more efficient and more productive athletes in all of these different ways, from techniques, equipment, rules, etc. What this does is standardize behaviors across these rules of sports science, that the bodies need to become ever more efficient, ever more productive, ever more precise in the ways that they play their particular sports. So sports science, as we might know, then looks to the body as a machine. And the idea is of this approach is to analyze and improve that machine to make it ever more efficient, ever better at its particular practice which it is trying to achieve, be it throwing the javelin or jumping over a bar. And so in doing so, what this brings the body into is this notion of McDonaldization. It's a theory created by George Ritzer, formerly University of Maryland professor, and the McDonaldization is a way to explain this standardization. So think of it as a theoretical tool, if you will, a possible way to explain this mass standardization across global sporting practices. So it's that standardization of forms of society in order to make them more efficient and productive. Ritzer was writing mostly about McDonald's and the fast food industry as a highly standardized, very efficient institution, of which McDonald's was the paragon, was the prime example. It had became the most efficient, highly standardized way where you go anywhere in the world to McDonald's and you're going to get a similar experience. Whilst there may be local differences, the approach is generally the same. And so what we can use is Ritzer's theory of McDonaldization and apply it to the sport realm. That sport is becoming highly McDonaldized. It is trying to create bodies that are ever more standard, ever more efficient, so wherever you go in the world, you get the same thing. If you're watching the javelin throw in Japan, the skills, the techniques, even the body itself that is used to throw the javelin is going to be similar to what you would expect in the United States, in South Africa, in Poland. Okay, so it's this idea, this McDonaldization, this mass standardization of sporting bodies that we're arguing. And here Ritzer gives us the 4 key components of McDonaldization. For Ritzer, it was all about efficiency, calculability, predictability, and control. These 4 elements help produce McDonald's as a relatively ubiquitous, standardized consumer space around the world. And if we think about it for our purposes, efficiency, it's all about making the body more efficient, making it more productive, and it reduces difference around the world. Now, what this does, this McDonaldization of athletic bodies, is recognize that to be more efficient, there are preferred bodily forms for each activity. Swimmers' bodies, boxer bodies, long-distance bodies, etc. So what sports science does, and sport coaching does, is to try to determine these ideal bodies, to try and create them, to try and produce them, and recreate them through different training strategies, performance techniques, and the various different ways that they're trying to standardize these bodies fit into a standardized model. So if we look at this collection of images, we see the normative expectations of what the ideal body for particular sports or activities look like. And at the elite level, these bodies are they try to be creative to optimize performance and increase efficiency within their own chosen particular activity. In that sense, bodies are globally McDonaldized or standardized across the globe such that there is very little difference in the way that they exist, the way that they move, the way that they are produced and reproduce the sporting spectacles. Now, it doesn't matter where the body is from. At an elite level, the bodies tend to look the same because they are subject to this global network of coaching, sports science information, who have identified what the ideal bodily form is, what the ideal training regimen is for these athletes to create them at the high performance level. Whether it's running or cycling or many other sports, the body is very much standardized globally. So you could argue that we lose a bit of identity, a bit of uniqueness as we are sucked into this McDonaldized sporting society and this McDonaldized sporting system. And depending on what activity we do, we are kind of spat out with a particular bodily shape according to efficiencies required from that body within that activity. Think about your own particular sporting experiences. Were you ever described to have an ideal physique or an ideal body for a particular sport? Did you give up a sport, or were you unsuccessful in a particular sport because you didn't have the requisite body style, whether it be height or form or weight or what have you? I think that in and of itself is telling us very much about the ways that sport are contested today. And through the global networks, only through the ways in which our technology and ideas are shared in the global 21st century, do these bodies become ever more standardized through that free-flowing information. And so what I'm going to argue as well is that there is some degree of individuality and local identity that can still be expressed through sporting performance. So the structure of the bodies might look similar, but in many, if not all activities, the ways these activities are performed does speak to some extent of local difference. And that's what we're going to look at in the next section. So as I said, within some activities, I think there is a national or localized dimension to bodily techniques. In spite of this ubiquitous McDonaldization of the sporting system, I still think, and I wonder what you think, in terms of there still being some localness, some individuality, some uniqueness based on particular national context. So despite the global standardization of sporting practices and bodies, there do indeed remain some ways through which local difference are expressed and embodied. I think this is a key slide. So despite what we talked about in terms of the standardization of bodies, in certain sporting aspects, local difference are embodied through physical cultural practices. And to understand this, we turn to the theories of Marcel Mauss, and specifically his understanding of techniques of the body. He wrote this in 1934, but I think it's still appropriate to what we are talking about today. He said that bodily practices or techniques and how bodies perform, they aren't simply a function of anatomy or physiology. In other words, these body techniques are also socially and culturally constructed, that the dominant social and cultural values of a particular context are used to shape and reshape bodies into particular expectations. This is emphasized in this quote where he refers to techniques of the body as, quote, the ways in which from society to society men know how to use their bodies, end quote. So through these techniques, they learn how to use their body, but these techniques are different from society to society. In other words, within different societies, there are differently normalized ways to perform the same function. We learn our society by learning these techniques of the body because they are different, even subtly, from place to place. And the classic example he used was walking. Another key thing he said was that the body was actually a technology that we use to carry out functions. We don't usually think of the body as a form of technology. We tend to think of the body as harnessing technology to make it more efficient, to make it faster. But what he's saying is that the body is what we use to carry out basic functions, that we use it as a form of technology. He said the technique of walking is socially and culturally specific, as people walk differently in different societies. For example, if you go to a country around the world where they drive on the left-hand side, our preference for how we walk would be different based on oftentimes the social nature of what side of the road you drive on. So if you go to London or you go to Europe and you're walking on the right side of the sidewalk, you may be bumping into a whole lot of oncoming walkers. There are also differences in terms of walking in a big city versus small town, how fast you have to walk, how much space you take up, how you navigate around different people. Think about if you've ever been to New York City and how crazy it is walking down the sidewalk. So our gait, the way we walk, is socially and culturally constructed. Also based on masculinity and femininity. Women tend to take up less space than men. Even the way that we sit. Think about the term manspreading, right? When we sit on public transportation and how we move about and how we use our body as a form of technology are socially and culturally constructed. That we tend to think of our bodies devoid of those contexts, but indeed our physical being, the essence of our body as a piece of sort of technology is influenced by the world around us. And also, as he said, the socially constructed techniques are what you see here. That the body we can see in all these different ways, in walking, in sitting, in running, in dancing, in swimming. They're culturally produced, they're reinforced by gender, class, ethnicity, etc. And what we can think about these in terms of changing time periods, but also in the contemporary moment as well. So even what were socially desirable bodies 100 years ago, that socially desirable body was much more corpulent. The more weight you possessed was a sign of wealth, whereas today it's probably the opposite. So across time, the changing nature of social values also influence which bodies are privileged, which bodies are marginalized, and therefore which bodies tend to be produced and reproduced in society. And so what we do then is we learn to use our bodies as in culturally normalized ways. Within each of these bodily movements on the last slide, you can see here, jumping, running, climbing, sitting, swimming, etc. There are normalized ways of carrying out these practices or functions we learn in our societies. And in doing that, what we are doing is this. The traditions of society are being transmitted back to us. So we learn these techniques because they are normative techniques that are communicated to us through speech and in other ways. It's how your parents teach you how to walk, how to run, how to sit, etc. It's how a coach might teach you how to play a particular version of the game. That these are normalized ways of learning about society through forms of embodiment. As many of you know, I'm an avid basketball player, and I also lived abroad in New Zealand for a period of time. And the way that I go about playing the game and I use my body is quite different than the game in the New Zealand or an international context. In the sport of basketball, internationally, the game is much more spread open, it is spread out, where shooting becomes much more of a dominant trait. And so the bodies are conducive to shooting the basketball, whereas for myself, I grew up in an American context where attacking the rim and penetrating through the lane was the dominant preferable method of scoring points. And so my game, but also my physique, resemble that and helps produce a way in which I play the game in a distinctly American way. And when I would play internationally, it would articulate back to my original roots. So the way in which I play the game of basketball is socially and historically constructed. So I want you to think about maybe your experiences and your own bodies of playing sport. Did you ever go to a different context, be it national, in a big city, small town, and the way you play the game was different, and indeed the way your body sort of took up a physical essence or physical being was different based on the way that you were conditioned and trained to play a sporting form. So through these various mechanisms, family, school, coaching, the mass media, the way we watch the game or what games we watch, we learn normalized body techniques of our society. In other words, we learn the national habitus, and that is obviously a key word, national habitus. So habitus, if you've never come across this term, what does it mean? It is derived from the word habit, and it is the seemingly natural but actually learned practices and preferences that become a natural part of who we are. We don't think about them. They are unconscious habits that we have learned as a result of being socialized into a particular society. We don't realize them necessarily, but they are the preferences or practices that are seemingly natural but actually culturally learned, that have become ourself, as it says here. So the national habitus is the way of being, the learned preferences or styles that we have learned as being socialized into a particular national culture. And I think that is key here relating to sport. So what does this ultimately have to do with sport then? The habitus has everything to do with sport, one might argue. It's the bodily culture and preferences that we learn as being socialized into a particular society. They are not universal. We throw differently in this country than do others. For example, when I went overseas and I played a season of cricket internationally, the way you throw a cricket ball is very different than the way you throw a baseball. In cricket, when you bowl, i.e. pitch, you cannot break your elbow. And so if you're throwing the ball in from the outfield to try and stop runners from running, you don't effectively bend your elbow in cricket. So you have almost a catapult of a throw. When I went and joined a cricket club, I threw it like a baseball, which was fine in the outfield. I wasn't breaking any rules. But the way in which I simply threw a ball was a reflection of my Americanness and the national habitus of throwing a ball in a U.S. context. So what I'm trying to say is that sports and the national habitus are linked. National ways of practicing and embodying particular cultural forms, they become expressed through sport. So as a result, the notion of national habitus leads us to think about the development of national sporting styles. And here we go then. This is the crux of the matter, the crux of this lecture. The shared embodied expression of what we call body habitus. So a national sports style is a common way and perception of the way things are done within a particular sporting practice. This is quite complicated, and this is where we get to see, yes, there may be sporting standard globalization in some ways, but this notion of national sport habitus means the local and the national can be expressed in bodily forms through sport. How might you ask? Well, national sporting styles are derived from these things: hard work, different training regimes, understandings of teamwork or the individual, the importance or non-importance of creativity, rule adherence, and gamemanship. The example that comes to mind is the way that Dominicans play the game of baseball. And there's a common expression that says, quote, "you don't walk off the island," end quote. And what that means is basically, in order to get noticed, you have to hit the ball. Whereas in the American context, where we might value on base percentage and the quality of drawing a walk to get to first base, is it's quite a valuable thing in the American context. In the Dominican context, it may not be suitable. And so the way that Dominicans play the game of baseball is a reflection of the global networks of diffusion and the desire to move off the island to enter into a much more potentially lucrative network of professional baseball. So here again are a few examples then in terms of cricket or football, baseball, which we talked about. Because what there are then, and this is another key slide I would say, a creation of common myths, expectations, or norms regarding the idealized national body. In other words, these national sporting styles emerge in what they really are myths of identity and particular nationalities, and are identified with embodying a sport in particular. They may be stereotypes, but they have considerable cultural significance because they idealize a national body and play an important symbolic function in creating a standard and shared national identity in its embodied form. So what we're saying is that these bodies, these famous international sport bodies, help to reproduce myths around what is a desirable and perhaps undesirable national sporting body. Specifically, athletes themselves play a particular sport in a certain way to come to embody the nation and are rallying points and instructive for what it means to be a member from that nation. They come to express local national identity and significant embodied forms because they represent this idealized national body, the body that people in those countries ascribe to look like. And I can't stress this enough. These are the norms of behavior that are generally speaking myths of identity and don't necessarily exist but are perceived by the public as being synonymous with the identity of that nation. So therefore, individuals who embody that myth within the eyes of the population they come to represent the country on that international stage and what dominant bodies should look like. So another way to think about it is this, that there is definitely a cycle of national sporting habitus. These embodied forms, these embodied norms or myths emerge out of cultural context. They come out of a response to some social, cultural, or historic formation. These norms are performed in particular ways by high-profile athletes, and crucially, I think they are represented by popular media. These athletes are really created as national sporting bodies and idealized as national heroes because they fit these norms by the way they are presented through the popular media and then television, the internet, newspapers, etc. Then these bodies are imitated by low-level athletes or general spectators. So those performed norms are then represented in the media and imitated in the public and therefore are reproduced in the minds of the general public. So this cycle goes on and reproduces itself, so these imagined bodies, through their performance and embodiment of the various elements of that national local style, they tend to get reproduced and reinforced. But I need to stress these norms are kind of myths. Again, really they are idealized forms of what the national body is and how the idealized national athlete should perform in a particular way. It doesn't allow room for many exceptions, and I would argue that it creates a marginalization of non-dominant bodies, non-dominant identities that don't fit this national sporting myth. So I think what you need to think about then is that national identity and how it becomes an embodiment as a way of a particular activity reinscribing what it means to be a member of that nation and that national habitus. It reproduces it, this cycle, and continues to circulate along the lines of these idealized national bodies. So in this last section, we're going to look at this cycle of national sporting habitus and what we are calling embodiments of a national sports style, from W.G. Grace to Neymar, popular footballer. And let's start with Grace then. The mythology of Englishness and the national habitus around idealized forms of English embodiment came to the fore through cricket, and cricket became the way that national habitus was expressed within Victorian England. So what you had was cricket played in a particular way, focused on the reserved, committed, reliable, honorable, and morally upright gentleman who was linked with Englishness. So how you played the game was a reproduction of what it meant to be English. And that's what I meant by the idealized national body. To be reserved, committed, reliable, you played cricket in that style, and even cricket terminology took up these types of aspects. There is a saying played within, there is a saying playing with a straight bat, which means doing things in an honorable way, in a virtuous fashion. Or it isn't cricket is another common phrase, which means simply not the way of doing things as a preferred or gentlemanly way or upright way of doing things. So cricket is, in this English phase, was synonymous with being correct, morally upright, committed, reserved, and reliable. The way that the game was played and the bodies that played it reinforced this Victorian era of Englishness. And out of that developed definitive cricket styles. An English way of playing cricket was technically correct, reserved, and dependable. And you can see these techniques very conservative, very defensive-minded in the way that the English played the game, and I would argue still play the game. They were transmitted around centuries from W.G. Grace to the 21st century and Alistair Cook, who plays with a quote-unquote straight bat, end quote, and within the traditional British technique of the body. There's a very traditional way of playing the game in a British context. Again, this style is synonymous with Englishness, and there was a definitive transition of this over the years. There's also a transmission of this of these assumptions and elements from that previous slide. And while I would say there is not as strong a link to British heritage and the Victorian era ideals as there is still a residual of that W.G. Grace way of playing the game. Now contrast that cricket style with the West Indian cricket style. In many ways, I think this is a response to the correct, reserved, and dependable English technique, which are countered by this normalized post-colonial West Indianness. And what we are saying here is there's a form of battling expression or technique emerged as a counterpoint to the stodgy conservative English way of batting. This bold, creative, and aggressive form of cricket in the post-colonial West Indian context was an important source of their identity. It was a rejection of those Victorian British ideals. So this technique or style, this very aggressive, flamboyant style, was closely linked to that emergent national habitus in the West Indies, in that period of decolonialization and the emergence of independence in the post-colonial West Indian identity. Remember, that's what's said here, that these national habitus codes come out of particular social formations and social contexts. The bodies of the West Indians and the way that they play the game were socially and culturally produced. It's that national sporting habitus linking back to the social and cultural construction of bodies. So this body, one might argue, is anything but natural, in other words. And this little segment will give you a good insight into this context on how cricket in this national habitus, this particular style of West Indian technique, was an embodied expression of West Indian identity. And the time, and to some degree, this is still the case, as it was in the 1970s and 80s largely. Another one we can turn to is the Japanization of baseball, and how the national habitus and the bodily cultural preferences and learned values or assumptions relate to bodily culture within Japan as expressed through the way that Japanese baseball has been adapted in a local context. It's really an interesting example to see this specific style, much of which is linked around Bushido warrior mentality, and it's come to the fore within Japanese baseball. So the national habitus in Japanese baseball come to mean the same thing. A lot about respect, hard work, to an incredible degree. They're all part and parcel of that national Japanese habitus. And so the way that sport, the way that an American game of baseball is picked up in the national context, links back to that Bushido warrior mentality. So there are different techniques or similar and also similar techniques to American baseball, but those cultural values of Japan rub off on the game and the way that it is played in this context. You can also see this influence in terms of how foreign players bring their localized and distinct styles of playing a particular practice back to a new nation. And so we have the controversy around bat flips in Major League Baseball. A great example, so we have here Jose Bautista, who famously hit a walk-off home run in the Major League Baseball playoffs, which upset many of the contemporary fans of Major League Baseball. It wasn't, quote-unquote, the right way to play the game. And so you have players like Brian McCann who take umbrage against players who are flashy. Now, many of these players come from Latin America, where that is the distinct way of playing the game. You go to a Major League Baseball game in these contexts, it's much more exuberant. There's celebration, there are bat flips, there's the exuberant celebrating of home runs, which doesn't sit well within the national sporting habitus of the way that the game is played here in the United States. And it links back to, in this case, the cultural politics of where those players are from, which manifests itself in the racial politics around the game. And so this discussion around playing the game the quote-unquote right way is, in one sense, a way to reproduce the national sporting style of a distinctly American way of playing the game, whilst it's being sort of contested by a new way or a new local sporting habitus. So these habituses are important, and the way that games and styles exist in this kind of moment in which players migrate from one country to another, they become flashpoints of contestation. So think about this, and think about other examples where these national sporting styles become sites or flashpoints of resistance or conflict in these global networks of sport. And alas, we can look at football or soccer, perhaps more than anything else. This sport does engender these myths, these national habitus myths in terms of the many different ways that the game is played in different countries. The great thing about it is that it's the same game, but it's able to invoke and express different national habitus in different places because bodily styles are expressed through the way the game is played and is perceived to be played. One of the examples is what in the 1970s, Dutch total football. It was a particular style of play that became synonymous with Holland around 1974, and it was a very flexible and fluid strategy that was synonymous with these players. It disrupted the rather standardized, stodgy way of playing the game previously. The outfield players for the Dutch were sufficiently skilled so that they could be interchanged with each other, so they weren't rigidly locked into their position. What this had was the effect of creating a very fluid and attacking and exciting form of football that revolutionized the sport. Although recent Dutch teams don't have the ability to continue this play, for a period of time this style of total football became clearly linked with Dutch national habitus, and it was the myth that the Dutch identity was closely linked to that flexible strategy. And so let's turn to perhaps a better example, and that's Argentinian football. Within Argentinian football and culture more generally, there's the ideology of the Criollo. Within Argentinian football, a Criollo style of play developed that helped to differentiate itself from British football in the early days of Argentinian soccer. So you have the British football, which is how the game was first diffused to Argentina through British migrants going there, and bringing that particular style that spoke to British habitus of discipline, rule-bound, physical, and collective football, not unlike British cricket in that sense. So this style of British football was then countered as the game was developed in the Argentinian context. So what you had was this Criollo football. It was much more restless, undisciplined, spontaneous, emotional, artful, creative, and dare I say, individualistic. Clearly very different from the British football, and it defined out of that Argentinian context to be distinct and unique from Britain. As Argentinian football emerged, those individuals who came to embody this Argentinian Criollo version of the game in the eyes of the public were the ones who fit this mold. So if you know anything about football, you may know where I'm going with this, but the individual who most embodied Criollo football was a fellow named Diego Maradona. He is thought to be the embodiment, as it says here, of Argentinian Criollo style. Thinking about that when I talk about myth, it's really a stereotype, and really what we are saying is that there is an Argentinian ideology out there and a way of understanding what it means to be Argentinian centered around this. It's a way that many Argentinians identify these elements at the core of what it is to be Argentinian. So you can see these stereotype myths are very closely related. This is the way Maradona and his career were understood as being a typical Criollo. A great example of this is being artful and being cunning, and as it shows here, Maradona was known for the hand of God goal in 1986 in the World Cup final when he basically handballed the goal into the ball into the back of the net in a 2-1 victory against, ironically, of all countries, England. I should say the World Cup quarterfinal. So the way it was talked about in England was that this was a cheat, that Maradona was disingenuous, immoral. He didn't play the right way because he effectively handballed the ball into the net. But in Argentina, it fit perfectly within this Criollo style. Do whatever it takes to win, even if it means kind of bending the rules. It showed that he was cunning, creative, and artful in doing what it took to beat the system, the dominance of the Britain football team. So two different national habitus related to the sport, the way that the game was played, and really how the media took up narratives around that event. And so he's often referred to, Maradona that is, as El Pibe de Oro, or the Golden Boy, a true embodiment of what it meant to be artful, creative, and individualistic in that Argentinian context. So here's a brief clip of the Hand of God goal, which he scores, after which you can see how he's skillful, individualistic, creative in the scoring the second goal to win the quarterfinal matchup. So again, think about the myth associated with Maradona and how, because he is Argentinian, he fits in that Criollo way of playing. He is from a different country. His skills and style of play would be framed perhaps differently. If he was British and he did this, it would be framed differently in that national sporting context. And having And if you watched his performance against the English, you would see what Archetti is talking about here, why he views it as being the most important performance in the history of Argentinian football. Not only because they won and they went on to win the World Cup that year, but because he did it in a way that embodied the Criollo style. Maradona was the essence of our style of playing, and he demonstrated why we call him El Pibe de Oro. He goes on to say that Maradona is a feeling, an essence of what it means to be Argentinian, a representative embodiment of that national sporting culture. In just the way he plays, he invokes and embodies that feeling of what it means to be part of the national habitus. And I think this is really a great quote, and it really gets to what we're talking about in this lecture. And I'm really bringing this up to date here to try and demonstrate a number of things. There's certainly something on the way that Maradona is perceived in Argentinian popular culture and the way that football great Lionel Messi is perceived, because it continues to be that Maradona is really the essence of Argentinian passion and identity, whereas Messi, arguably the greatest player of all time and a greater player than Maradona, he's perceived as being largely European, overly rational, and too professional. Now here is Messi, a middle class and a representative embodiment of Argentina, and Maradona was poor and a bit more outrageous. And so their upbringing and the way that social class impacted on their own physical bodies, but also the way that they play a game, is really important. Messi, for example, he leaves Argentina at a very early age, at age 13, to head to Europe to become schooled in Barcelona's academy. So he never got that kind of street style of playing the game that Maradona had. And because of that, because their styles are similar yet different, Maradona still maintains this status within society as a representative embodiment, where Messi, whilst arguably the greatest player of all time, has never truly captured that Argentinian national identity, because he doesn't quite play it in the same way, in that Criollo style that articulates to the national habitus of Argentina. And lastly, in this section, we'll talk about the Brazilianization of football, or football in Brazilian football, as Brazilian culture calls it. There is the myth of the origin of Brazilian football, and that's Charles Miller brought it from Britain to Brazil in 1894, apparently with a ball under each arm, and brought it to the nation. He was an important figure in the development of the game, but not in his Brazilianization, not in the way that the game was localized and became a part of Brazilian culture. Because over a period of 1890 to the 1950s, this is what happened. Political, media, and intellectual forces appropriated the game to try and create it as part of a new modernizing Brazilian nation, as they successfully did. And within a number of decades, at least by the 1930s, Brazil was synonymous with football, and football articulated what it meant to be Britain. And in so doing, there are a number of different ways that this happened. One thing was that football was certainly linked with other aspects of Brazilian culture in capoeira, samba, carnaval. Now, capoeira is a hybrid form of dance and martial arts that emerges within slave cultures within Brazilian society, as it was a form of resistance, physical culture that slaves performed as a form of opposition to their slave owners. And so what we see here is there are all these forms of popular resistance within each of these perceived authorities of Anglo-Saxon society elites and later European ways of being. Certainly within soccer, the British model of the game was resisted, like it was in Argentina, and in the same way in capoeira, the samba, and carnaval resisted mainstream social elites and their physical cultural practices. So here in Brazil, you had football creating its own oppositional movement to the discursive and cultural influence of Britain, and it came to represent a real localized form of Brazilian identity. And as a result, what happened was this. Football in Brazil was appropriated in very different ways, but akin to the Argentinian context. And as Freire says here in the 1930s, our football seemed to contrast with the European one due to the amount of qualities such as surprise, skill, cleverness, speed, and at the same time, individual brilliance over the collective, stodgy way that the British played. So in saying this, European soccer was florid, boring, dull, mechanical, highly rationalized, linking back to the rationalized movements of the Industrial Revolution, while Brazilian soccer reminded him of dancing, of capoeira, of carnaval, and it links back to the oppositional discourse of samba and carnaval and capoeira in this local context as an expression and creation, formulating the foundation of Brazilian football. And whether this is true or not, and again, it may be a myth or a stereotype of Brazilian football, it emerged around this dichotomy, as Freire says, between Brazilian football arts, that sort of dancing in which the person is prominent, as opposed to European and English football, wherein personal action is mechanized and subordinate to structures of power. So here you can see this dichotomy in the nations of Brazil in its national habitus in opposition to European national habitus or football style. I think this is a key distinction that is made, and still within Brazilian culture, you see it, this privileging of the world of football as art, that they don't always live up to it, as you see maybe in the 2014 World Cup, which Brazil lost to a highly mechanized European style of European football when Germany dismantled them 6-1 in the World Cup semifinal. However, there's this assumption that what it means to be Brazilian is to play the game in a particular way. And so although they lost to Germany, Brazil still embodied that flamboyant style. And some argue that the loss was because they had gotten away from this flamboyant style, that Brazilian football had become too influenced by the European game, as many of those players had gone to Europe to ply their craft in the English Premier League. And one of the explanations by locals in Brazil was that the game had become too standardized, and when Brazil played a standardized game against a European foe, the German, the Germans, the kind of archetype of a highly standardized rational approach, that Brazil stood ultimately no chance. And so it's clear here, it's linked to that capoeira discourse, and a movement since the 2014 World Cup has been to reintroduce the capoeira discursive elements to the game. Those rhythmic movements side by side to deceive an opponent, to work around them, to play the game in a beautiful way. That's what that sort of mentality, that physicality, and the bodies that inhabited it played in that national sporting context. So within Brazil, what we have then is this ideal, the embodied national body. The football art expressed, typified in the late 1950s and early 60s, as opposed to the football força, the mechanized, not very expressive, a typically European dimension of the game, rather than the creative, expressive, innovative player of the Garrincha. And so where does Neymar fit in? Basically those common assumptions of the idealized national body of the football art player. Neymar has been positioned due to his skillful, artful play, which no doubt he tries to imitate when he's playing. And he did so as a youngster. He became socialized into that national sporting habitus, playing the game in a particularly artful and creative way. Now he's been positioned in that regard as someone who is helping Brazilian rediscover that football art, that essence of what it means to be Brazil through football, as it says on his debut: agility, dribbling, step-overs, joy, creativity, the missing ingredients of what the Brazilian team lacks. And that he's the embodiment in and through the skill and style of his play. Neymar becomes the poster boy, if you will, for football arte in contemporary Brazil, rediscovering the lost art of Brazilianness in football. And quite interesting, if you look at this Nike commercial from the 2014 World Cup, they dare to be Brazilian and, quote, nobody plays like us, end quote. But still very much this commercial is about playing on the notion that daring to be Brazilian is playing a daring, artful style of football, not that mechanized football of the game. And ultimately in 2014, it was probably to their undoing, where Brazil went down to heavy defeat. And again, like I said, there have been calls to reintroduce a pure football art back to the game, as many of these players have arguably lost it playing overseas for traditional European powers. So Neymar is really a good example of this. As you see the quote there, football is a sport and a machine which socializes people into Brazil. It socializes them into a particular expectation of what Brazilianness is, what the centrality of a particular style of play is, and it link backs and reinforces Brazilian national identity. That these players, they become transmitted, celebrated, and normalized and reproduced a distinctly Brazilianness. So there you have it, a cycle of reproduction within the national sporting habitus, the cycle of reproduction that is responsible for the nurturing and endurance of specific sports styles in particular countries. Yes, they may be based on stereotypes, yes, they may be based on myths, but they have real effects in the way that they reproduce themselves, and people reproduce their own understanding of national identity. So the focus on this topic is really how and why specific styles of play endure within particular nations, because I think they do. And I think it's still possible in some sports, not all sports, to see, as Gertz would say, within the public display of sport and games, we can see the structure, fabric, logics, value of a culture, and it can be communicated in the very style and play of that culture. And I think this is true that the national habitus is embodied, it's celebrated within certain countries and within particular sports, and we've looked at a number of those sports as well. I think we can see the process of how and why that happens. We can see certain bodies become expressive and extensions of national preference, values, and identities, and how the national habitus endures within and through these sporting bodies. And while global standardization is certainly there, bodies tend to look the same according to the activities that they are involved in. Sporting techniques and styles do seem to be important in certain areas and practices for that reproduction expression of local difference. So it's the globally local, the glocalized body that we're referring to here. So I think that most of you by now get an understanding that these national bodies, these styles and habitus, are going to be important parts of ways in which sporting techniques, styles, and expressions are played in games and continue to be played. So now move on to the required readings, complete your quiz and discussion response, and perhaps you may elect to do your essay on this topic.